knowing what a virus is I think important as well to debunking one of the common scapegoats. Now, I'm not saying that they have nothing to do with the disease. They sometimes do. But the relationship that they do have to the formation of disease is misrepresented in some cases. And what they actually are as a thing, their identity, that is definitely misrepresented. So if you want to understand this, we have to travel back. And here's where I will actually diverge a bit from what I've written here and give you a bit of a longer history. But what I've written here as well is also very interesting. But basically, if we go back in the Earth's history, billions of years, to where there was this kind of primordial soup under very, very different conditions, where there wasn't even free oxygen in the atmosphere. So there were no animals, because animals breathe oxygen. We had to wait for the free oxygen in the atmosphere before we were capable of evolving. You have in the early Earth, you have like all these kind of, early forms of single-celled organisms. And I think from memory that the name that we attribute to the earliest ones is called archaea. So basically being these ancient archaic ancestors of all bacterium. Now, if you want to look at how they came about, have a look into abiogenesis as a concept. There's a guy on YouTube called Aaron Ra who has done a whole bunch of videos where he explains abiogenesis really, really well. So I'd highly recommend having a look at his stuff. And if I think about it, I'll add it to the documentation if you want to see that, or at least his channel link so you can find it. But so abiogenesis talks about experiments done which have proven and shown that under the conditions present in the early Earth, that we can, in these natural conditions, form the precursors to the first life. So if you look at what is in a bacterium, in terms of things like RNA, the cell membrane, which is a layer of fatty acids, and ribosomes and various other like rudimentary kind of things, what we can show is that they do in fact form through natural processes in the right conditions. That has been done in a lab, and through geological studies, they have shown that those conditions did exist. So abiogenesis is looking at all of these things and showing how, yes, like early Earth, these conditions, these chemicals, it's a viable hypothesis put into this proposed theorem. I don't know whether it's an accepted theorem or just a proposed theorem, nor in fact do I really know exactly all the details of, the formalization of theorem, but that's not the point here. The point is just about that it's showing that we can create the components that will make the ancient bacterium. And through making the ancient bacterium, then we can look at the specialization of bacterium, and then we can look at how we go from single-celled organisms to multicellular organisms, which in general goes through, I would say, kind of three pathways. And this is where I will differ from other descriptions, but I'll say it in this way for the following reasons. So the first version of a multicellular organism is where you have what we think of as single-celled organisms in the terms of single-celled animals being protozoans and single-celled algae or plants that are not a larger algae like a kelp, but a single-celled algae. So in both of these two cases, you have a symbiosis where the chloroplast inside the cell of the algae is most likely what used to be a completely independent bacterium, which inserted itself inside another bacterium and started to perform the service of producing energy, right? Or at least converting energy, shall we say. So it's basically taking energy, taking carbon dioxide and combining these things, and taking water as well, so that we can basically take the hydrogens and the oxygens and the carbons and combine them into carbohydrates. So we're basically taken the kinetic energy coming down in the form of charged particles from the sun, like, we've got the photons of light, we've got heat and other things, and these plants can take in that energy and use it to bond together, to break and rebond the elements that make up water, and carbohydrates, and carbon dioxide to make carbohydrates. Now, some of these carbohydrates might have side chains or side elements of other things as well, and that's what will form, aside from the length of them too, this is what will form different types of carbohydrates. You have simple carbohydrates and more complex carbohydrates, but in general speaking, what we're doing is we're storing energy in a chemical potential form in this molecule. So if you want to think about that as a multicellular organism, we have one organism inside another. Now, over time, it lost its independence and the chloroplast became an organelle. But just like the mitochondrion in the cell of an animal, and a protozoan, a single-celled animal, has mitochondrion in it to produce its energy, the mitochondrion is like the chloroplast. They both have their own genetic material. What you have is bacterium with just RNA, not DNA. And the bacterium can share this genetic information directly. They can pass packets of RNA to each other. And in doing so, and there was experiments that prove this, is that you can have a bacterium which has the ability to resist some kind of environmental toxin. So it might be really, really good at dealing with one thing or another that might kill other things. And because it can share that genetic information with other bacterium, it can literally just produce it and pass it to others, and now they can survive that thing too. So if you culture a bacterium in a petri dish, and you then add such a toxin, but you might have maybe, for example, known that you had in that culture a smaller colony of a bacterium which had already been exposed to and mutated and developed to have a resistance to this thing, then what you will see as you add this poison is that around the smaller colony of the one immune, you're going to see things surviving, right? Now, it might be at the edges that they all died off because the message couldn't get through to them fast enough for them to take it in and for them to replicate it, possibly. Depends upon how you would run the experiment, but the point being is that it's going to share that information. Why? Because cooperation is extremely valuable in terms of survival and thus evolution. Those cells which cooperate do better than those that always and only compete. And that is why you have more cooperations. If you look at the whole field of biology, cooperation dwarfs competition, absolutely. But the thing is that competition is sexier for TV. You have bacterium sharing genetic information. You have the earliest plants and animals as kind of single cellular, but this is why I'm counting it as 3 versions of multicellular, because if you've got one cell inside another, well, that's a kind of multicellular, right? So we just call that of like one path of multicellular life where it goes into that sort of thing and then stops there, right? It's like it's a shorter pathway. Why? Because there's less you can do with it, right? But nonetheless, it's based upon the same principles. A different principle is the idea of a colony, where you have, for example, with a coral, you have many, many plants and animals working together on a very, very small scale, but then together collectively they make up this colony, which we see as a coral. But if you break up that coral, it will like regrow because the individual components are little completely independent units, right? They can, like one grouping of the plant and animal that is, successfully paired can create an entire new coral. Right, now, I don't know if some of them abide by a slightly different rule where you would need 2 because there's some kind of sexual or near sexual component to it. I have no idea. I haven't researched corals, but I'm sure somebody who's an expert can tell you that. Maybe there is, maybe they're not, maybe they're all asexual. I don't know, and I don't really care. It's like I think that there might be, because if I remember correctly, there's like coral spawning events, isn't there? Like where they also release eggs or something. So there's probably a component, something like that in there, but I don't know exactly the details. I'm not by any means read up on that. But the point was just to say that that's that second pathway of being multicellular, is multicellular as a community rather than some kind of embedding. The third field, of course, is us. So where now what we have is we have cells side by side, right? Now, we also have the cell embedded thing because we have the mitochondrion. there is a possibility as yet unproven, because if it is true, unlike the mitochondrion, they've lost their own genetic material, right? So they're now just a little organelle, but it's possible they might have been separate things previously with their own genetic material. Possible. Nobody knows. Or at least if they do know, I haven't seen the research into it just yet. But point being, you have kind of like if you got a whole bunch of protozoans and put them next to each other and bonded them together and then specialized them into cell types and tissue types and organ types and system types into an entire body. Now, the reason I raise this about that evolutionary pathway, archaea to bacterium, single-celled animals and plants to the corals, and then to the multicellular plants and animals, and fungi, of course, as well. How do you go from single-celled to multicellular? What's that process? Because we know that there was a time when there were only single-celled things. We know from the internal components of the single-celled things that they are effectively just different versions of the exact same things in the cells of multicellular organisms. Now, there are some things which might be in multicellular cells but not in single-celled organisms, for the simple reason that we are more evolved, right? They have like a kind of like, they probably still evolve, but there's a limitation to what you can do with a single cell, and even just like a colony of that single cell or a culture of that single cell, like in whatever they communicate, there's still a limitation. You need to start grouping cells together in various ways to form more complex structures. And in chemistry, structure is function. Bacterial cells are typically a lot smaller than animal or plant cells. Why is that? Because the functionality required for a multicellular organism is vastly more complex. There's more of it. There's more scope of what it has to be able to do. It has to have way more interactions in a way more complex system. And so in order to express that chemically, you need a greater scale. It's just that simple. So the multicellular organism cells tend to be much, much larger than the bacterial cells. And then you have bacterial cells that are so simple they can fit inside another bacterial cell. And I've even seen one case where I think there was an insect which inside its cells has a bacterium, and that bacterium, and it's a very, very tiny insect, mind you, as well. And then inside that insect cells, inside the bacterium, there's like another bacterium. There was like this sort of nesting going on there. And that was kind of viewed in some experiments of some paper where, they were looking at it. And so what that kind of shows is like a bit of the link, because this was still a relationship between bacterium, which weren't just operating in symbiosis, but they could also still operate independently, both of them. That pathway from being fully independent to so symbiotically merged that they become the one thing. And it's also important here to, as well, just state something about cells. The cell membrane, being semi-permeable, can take small particles across, pushed by the forces of diffusion and osmosis. It can push larger particles or pump them against gradients using protein pumps embedded in the cell membrane. But there's a third thing they can do as well, which is to use fatty vesicles or little bubbles of fatty acids to pass in and out of the cell something which is too large and too complex to get in by diffusion or get out by diffusion or to go via a protein pump. So if you imagine like the cell membrane as being this fatty membrane, and you want to get a big molecule out of the cell, like you might have some kind of toxic material inside the cell, just broken rubbish and stuff, and you want to get rid of it because it's nothing that you can recycle and do anything with, and you're cleaning up the cell. So what you would do is you would surround that with fatty acids so that when it, as a blob, goes to the inner membrane, the inner wall of the cell membrane, the fatty bubble merges with the cell membrane. This object can now form an outer hole in the membrane and pass out, right? Still contained in a bubble of fatty acids if you want, or just pushed out as it is. And in doing so, it's like a little airlock, right? I mean, not an airlock, but a fluid lock, so that you keep the internal environment of the cell completely enclosed. It is never broken because of that merging of the fatty bubble with the cell membrane. And you can do the same thing in reverse. So you can pass an object in or pass an object out, and never ever is the inside environment exposed to the outside environment, excepting insofar as that whatever part of it might also be enclosed in that little bubble, that bit gets exposed, but nothing else does. And this is one of the things that's going to keep the cell, integrated and whole, and, with a control over how things come in and out. Now, the body is very, very good at identifying what things are. And because of this capacity to surround things in like little mini membranes or in like kind of little fatty bubbles, that fatty bubble of its own might contain any number of things. Now, if you want to identify what's in the cargo without opening the cargo, what can you do? Well, the thing inside of it could have a sugar or a protein or something which kind of sticks through or pokes through the membrane of the fatty vesicles surrounding it. Or in the process of putting it inside, knowing what you are putting inside a little fatty bubble, you might attach some little marker to it, maybe made of a sugar, maybe made of something else. So there's various ways that you could mark that. And then something else which comes along and wants to know what's inside this thing can read that marker and know, oh, okay, this is containing that. Now, I don't know specifically if that's exactly how it happens. I'm just saying that this is the type of thing that we can do with chemistry. And I know that there are places where stuff like that does happen in the body. So I'm just applying it to this other area as a way of explaining a principle. Viruses are very different. So what actually is a virus? Well, okay, so imagine that your body is interacting with a virus. Now, actually, before I go into that, I'll just talk about the scale, the size of viruses. If the virus is the thing which is too large to diffuse across, right, because there's a whole bunch of genetic material, right? So if it's too large to just be pushed across by diffusion, well, clearly you're going to want to surround it in a fatty bubble. Now, that fatty bubble is just like a suitcase, right? Is my suitcase a pair of socks because it contains a pair of socks? No, it is not. My suitcase is not a pair of socks. It's a container. Why would our body, if these things were pathogens, right, and their sole purpose was to cause disease, why would our body so happily interact with them? Do we allow them to be inside little fatty bubbles to go in and out of cells? Yeah, we do. Do we allow them to upload this otherwise extremely well protected nucleus of the cell where, the genetic material's in there? Do we allow them to interact with that? Yes, we do. Now, there's an area of the cell which was previously referred to as junk DNA, and I don't know if they've gotten a new name for it yet, but I do remember reading that there was some research done showing how this area is actually a lot more structured and very, very functional than what anybody thought. They thought it was just like little bits and pieces of garbage left over that just happened to be genetic material. What they've actually now found is that it's very important. It's an organized area where, yeah, sure, there's bits of genetic material lying around, but when we are doing things relating to genes, so for example, the nucleus may, for whatever reason, put out some piece of genetic material, and that might then interact with this junk DNA area for various purposes. I suspect as well, and I can't remember whether I read this in the article or whether it was something that kind of occurred to me because of reading the article, but I suspect that what will be proven at some point, if it's not already, is that the viruses will interact with that junk DNA area. And the reason being is this: the bacterium that we spoke about earlier, which had to evolve into different things to become plants and animals, they had the ability to share genetic information. Now, this is so incredibly useful. It is such a massive survival advantage, such a massive advantage for, the adaptation of bacterium to different environments. And we know that it happens. We know that it does that. Like, there's no doubt about this. It is known. It is proven and shown, right? So they share genetic material. What evolutionary pressures exist to lose this extremely valuable functionality just because you're going from one cell to two cells? There's none. There's no pressure to lose it. What evolutionary pressures exist for you to keep it? Well, there's every valid reason you could ever imagine. So if you've, and the other thing too is just this, if you think about it, right, for two cells to actually know who they are talking to, like, are you a cell of the same type as me or a different type as me? They need to be able to pass some kind of chemical information. What better information than genetic material? Now, they could also use sugars and proteins and other things too, and I'm sure they do. But for certain purposes, genetic material would be possibly even the only possibility, because the other things might not be able to express chemically the information required that is the thing that you want to transmit and be understood on the other end. And if you think about symbiosis, where cells are going to start to not just work together and live together, but to specialize and to stay together so that they each have a copy of the other, even though they are specialized, like a full copy. And so when they replicate, they can replicate another perfectly paired thing. You cannot do that without genetic information being passed. You can't. Add that to the fact that we know there are no evolutionary pressures to keep it, so to lose it, and every evolutionary pressure to keep it. So these three facts combined mean that our solution set to this equation of did this functionality get kept is yes. There is one answer in the solution set. It's yes. It's no other answer. There's not a maybe, no, it's just yes. Because you cannot do it without it. And it makes no sense. Like, where is this evolutionary pressure coming from to lose a functionality which benefits you regardless of whether you're single or multicellular? And when you are multicellular, it's even more essential. Because now you've got to communicate with another cell that you need an exact copy of, but you're going to specialize. How is it going to know what you specialized in, especially in these early cases of evolution? So for that cooperation to work, you have to have it. And as each generation of evolution goes on and this cluster of cells gets bigger and bigger and bigger and starts to specialize more and more and more, there's no sudden impetus of a new evolutionary pressure to lose this ability and to lose it completely, for it to be wiped out, right? Nothing like that can ever come about. Doesn't matter how far you iterate it, it won't ever come about. Nor is there going to be an evolutionary or a lack of evolutionary pressure to keep it. There's always going to be this huge set of reasons to keep it. With a bacterium, they're just dealing with single-stranded RNA, much, much simpler, right? And they can pass these packets of RNA to each other and implement them very, very quickly as well. The more complex a multicellular organism gets, at some point along that early evolution, RNA turned into DNA. And it may very well have had to do with this pairing, that maybe the whole thing of becoming DNA is a requirement at some point in that specialization. The ability to pass the genetic information must have had to evolve as well. We specialize the ability to share genetic information, and that's what we did, and that's what we know we did because we see the evidence. So, what is a virus? It is the evolution of that ability to pass and share and implement genetic information. And we know it because of all of these other certainties. We know it because if it wasn't, right, if that's not what a virus was, then we would have to show a pretty much identical thing that for some reason is not the same thing, even though it's otherwise identical, that does all the same functions, because we know we had to inherit it. So unless you can find some explanation as to why two identical things both exist, one of them for some mysterious reason and one is mysteriously different even though it's not, do you see, the argument doesn't work. So therefore that's what viruses have to be. Bacterium are just replicating, they're just splitting and replicating themselves, right? But now as we got into specialization of multicellular organisms, now we can have sexual reproduction as well. And now we have a way of populations and different colonies of species who might be genetically mutating in different ways because of different environmental conditions, but they're still similar enough to each other to share this information, but now they want to share much, much bigger packets of it. So sexual reproduction, breeding, allows that full interchange and also allows a kind of like an almost random mix-up. Here is just another example of why sharing genetic information is important, but here it's like it's a very, very different version of it. So instead of having an evolved version of the bacteria's ability to pass genetic information, which can now deal with DNA rather than just RNA, right? So that's what the virus is there. It's something which can deal with DNA, the double-stranded helix, rather than just RNA. Sequences of DNA making up genes, and then collections of genes making up a genome for a species. What a virus has to be able to do is to deal with that more complex world, right? And hence the reason why I think that it interacts with that junk DNA area, because what it's going to need to do is it's going to need to have some mechanism because the whole purpose of doing it will be to share specific genes, to replicate, make sure it's throughout your whole body, and then to share it with others via the virus. So, and also to know which ones not to interact with as well. You have no reason to think of it as some kind of external organism, especially where the genes they actually contain, where do they get those genes from? Us. Do they have a purpose without us? No. Could they therefore have evolved separately from us? No. In their form, they have no ability to exist without us. In chemistry, structure is function, and viruses are much, much smaller than even the smallest bacterium. They're tiny, and they just don't have the scale to implement enough functionality to argue a case for them being an organism. And if you combine that with the fact that their existence depends on us, and they're completely unstable outside of our body. Like, yeah, they can be transmitted, but they don't last long, right? Whether it be oxygenation or, I'm not sure what the word for it is, but, breakdown by photons of light, where the intensity of various spectrums of light literally just break apart their molecular structure, right? They are not stable outside of us. They can be in a little protective bubble of something. They can last a little while, maybe like a bit of shade and other things, there are various reasons why they might last longer in certain areas than others. But the point is, they're not very happy outside of us. They're far happier inside of us. They just last long enough that as you walk along, you are leaving behind you a wake, a trail, a cloud of both bacterium and viruses, and possibly other little sort of microbial things as well. But that cloud could be lasting long enough that other people walk through it, they breathe it in, and then they're going to interact with it. Now, we're doing this all the time. And the vast majority of our lives, we never notice, right? Like, you literally do not notice it going on. And that's because that any damage done, any resource usage, if your body is generally healthy, it's like your body does it with ease. But of course, if you're already sick, if you are sleep deprived, if you are nutritionally deficient, if you have like a toxic excess of something which is otherwise a nutrient, but you have too much of it in your body so it becomes toxic, heavy metals, insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, plastics, you name it. There are so many things which our bodies can cope with, right? And when we're young and healthy, we cope with them. But as time goes by and time goes by, the damage builds up and the damage builds up. And unless we have a way of getting ourselves out of the situation where we're exposed to too much of it from too many different angles, then it's gradually debilitating us. And at some point in time, you then encounter something which any other day of your life you wouldn't notice. But today you got the sniffles. If it's worse, you might then get sick. If it's even worse, you might get seriously sick. If you're old or seriously depleted and vitamin D deficient and everything else, then sure, you could die. But for the vast majority of people, we can be exposed to the exact same things and you don't notice a damn thing. Why? Because there's no disease being passed around. There is something else being passed around which certain people cannot cope with. And this mistaken identity of the virus as an external pathogen just goes against all this other evidence, right? It is not congruent with many things that are proven and factual. It is a bad explanation of the data, right? It's a bad explanation. And it really should have been dropped a long, long time ago. I know that there are people out there, and I've seen articles that I'm sure you can find. If I can find it, I'll add it in here in the document. But and I did see it a while ago. There was research done into, I think the guy's name was Beecham, but basically he was saying the same thing, right? So I'm not quoting his work. I'm because I actually didn't know about him until after I'd sort of come down these thought paths, but I'm saying something which is extremely similar to what he was saying. And it just adds like a little bit more detail in certain areas. I haven't seen his work, but from everything that I've heard and other people quoting bits of it to me, I can see that he came at it from a different direction. Environment, both externally and internally, maintains a state of balance. We call that state of balance health. When we go out of balance, we enter dysfunction, and this is now disease. And the word literally tells you what it is: dis-ease. You are in a state of dis-ease. That's just what it means. There's no substance. Nobody's ever shown a substance for any disease. There are substances involved with diseases. There are diseased substances that are, organic living substances suffering the disease, but there is no actual disease substance itself to pass on. The disease is the state of the system in question. That's it. With all that in mind, we have this mistaken identity of viruses, which appears to be connected to a bunch of agendas surrounding big industries that make trillions of dollars globally, and which are in many cases connected to people who have these bigoted beliefs about them being, the superior race or whatever, like some complete bullshit. They don't even understand that in biology and evolution, there is no such thing at all of an absolute superiority when you're speaking about genetics and evolution. There is only a relative superiority where you can say this thing from this genetic pattern is superior to that specific thing or that specific set of specific things with respect to this particular set of conditions and this task or objective. You have to be that specific before you can define anything as relative to that alternative, relatively superior in this context for this purpose. Otherwise, to say something is superior is to argue that it is an absolute, and that is just horse shit, right? There's no absolute in superiority. What might be superior in one set of conditions might be inferior to the exact same things, and perhaps even the one that you thought was the weakest in a different set of conditions. It's also true to say, and I'll just cover this while we're on the topic, that to interpret evolution as meaning survival of the fittest is to show that you didn't understand it, all right? There is no element of the modern theory of evolution which is called survival of the fittest. There is no element which can be called survival of the fittest unless you cherry pick one particular scenario for one particular element, ignoring all others, and you're just isolating it in that one cherry-picked thing. And in that condition, yeah, fine, you could call it survival of the fittest, but it is not by any means a description of the whole. It's just not. The particular thing that you would have to cherry pick, which is a part of the modern theorem, is the idea of natural selection. And people misinterpret natural selection as meaning survival of the fittest, but that's not what it means. It only means this: that which survives is selected by natural forces, full stop. It's not making any interpretation of it being the fittest for survival necessarily. And I'll give you an example. If you have two populations, in fact, I'm going to give you several examples just to show you how widespread this is, okay? If you have two populations of some species, right? And there are genetic differences between these populations, but an asteroid hits and wipes out one population. What was the natural selection criteria? It was not being at ground zero. That was the selection criteria. Was that in any way genetic? Nope. Right? Nothing to do with a superiority. It was just the pure accident of not being there. That's why that population survived and this one didn't. They could have been weaker for all you know. They were just lucky, right? The trend over time is that natural selection under the totality of all forces will result in gradual changes that trend towards survival. Why? Because the things that don't tends to get wiped out. Now, I'll give you another example. You have a population. Within that population, there is a new mutation, something new. The only individual who has it is this one individual. And it's actually a really beneficial mutation. Like, it's going to do some amazing good. Unfortunately, that animal gets wiped out. It's gone. There you go. You didn't even get the chance to breed with it. Maybe it wasn't even mature yet. It got picked off by a lion. And it wasn't. It was vulnerable, like young one. It just got picked off by a lion or whatever. You know, it was actually the best of that species ever born, right? Under the conditions that they live in, right? But it was the one that died, you know? Now, there's a probability that being the possessor of some greater thing, that maybe it will be the one that does survive, right? And over time, with enough incidences occurring, we get more of certain things surviving than not. But what we're talking about with natural selection is just that, a lion coming and eating you when you're a cub and you can't defend yourself and your mum wasn't fit or strong enough to defend you and your dad was nowhere to be seen. It's like, that's just a process of natural selection, and that is all it means, a process of natural selection. It's got nothing to do with you being fittest or not. Whether or not you are fittest for the particular situation is a common factor, but it is not a necessary factor. Actually, I'll give you one more because I like this one as well. Within the same population, one individual of an amazing set of new genes that's like way amazing in what it can do. But that population, that species, has some kind of like animal behavioral, psychological, kind of cultural thing where there are a group of dominants within the group, and it's not the child of one of the dominants. And they look at this thing and they say, this is going to be a threat to us one day, and they kill it while it's still young and vulnerable. Was it a better genetic pattern for all of the things that this population has to go through? Absolutely it was. Died anyway. And that is because of one of the other parts of the modern theory of evolution. I can't remember whether it's called genetic drift, or I don't think it's genetic drift. I think there's another one which has a similar name, but I've just lost it off the top of my head right now, that if you have a population of individuals and you have all sorts of variations of genetic things within that population, within the individuals of the population, then those things which are numerous, even if a few of them get wiped out, they're only going to go from numerous to slightly less numerous. And even if it happens again, they're only going to go from slightly less to slightly less to slightly less to, okay, they're sort of, the average of the group to slightly less to slightly less. And eventually, if it keeps on happening faster than their ability to breed, fine, it will eventually get down to the bottom end. And then if it happens again, it'll be wiped out. Any new genetic pattern which comes from a mutation or comes from an interbreeding with another population, and it's only like one instance in this population, it begins at the bottom end. It's right next to being wiped out. And given all of the sort of random things that might happen, there's a higher probability of it getting wiped out while there's only one, right? And then there might be two or three, and now it's got a slightly lower probability of getting wiped out, but there's only two or three. There's still a much higher probability. But as time goes by and more of it breeds, the trend is that when these things happen, while it is quite common for them to get wiped out, and that's it, you lose that genetic pattern until maybe it reoccurs, But otherwise, hopefully, it eventually kind of gets bigger and bigger numbers. And as time goes by, the probability of it getting wiped out gets less. It's all about this whole thing of how genes survive within a population and the probabilities of whether or not they get wiped out or whether they continue based upon the history, right? And based upon the random events that occur.